Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Magic Circle. Please welcome the president of the Magic Circle, Scott Penrose.
Splendid. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome to an historic evening because we're lecturing this evening, or lecture this evening is being streamed live with the SAM in America. So welcome to everybody who's watching in the States. And this is our first lecture share, shall we call it, with the SAM. Yesterday we had a rather splendid lecture from Jeff McBride, so many thanks to Jeff for lecturing and kicking the initiative off. So well done, Jeff. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And also we had a rather splendid hands-on session earlier on this evening, and many thanks to Rob Gould, who I hear excellent feedback from. So thank you very much indeed, Rob. Well done. Great. So there's an interactive element towards with this evening's lecture. So people on the Facebook stream or the Magic Circle stream can ask questions online via Facebook, and they'll come through to the computer here. But also those in SAM can use their SAM chat system to ask questions of Ian, so we can filter those through towards the end of the evening. Now, what the American friends of ours can't see today is that there's a very bleary-eyed audience because they haven't slept for the last 72 hours because they've all been at the Blackpool Magic Convention having a great time. So, without further ado, we'll introduce our lecturer this evening. The lecture is called All Done by Kindness, and of course that's David Devant. That's his moniker, or was. And David Devant was, of course, the first president of the Magic Circle, and it's very apt because it's 150 years since David Devant was born this year. So, back in 2003, I was tasked with the job of putting on a David Devant lecture for the Magic Circle Collectors' Day, and all I had to do was build an educated goldfish from Our Magic, but I was looking for a co-producer to help put the show together, and that co-producer that I had, who did a splendid job back then, was none other than our lecturer this evening, and he's highly qualified for it. So, put your hands together and please welcome our lecturer this evening, Ian Keable.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, and good evening. Thanks for coming along, and welcome also, of course, to the SAM. Delighted to have you on board. I'm not quite sure what time it is in the States now, but delighted to have you here anyway. So yes, the subject of my lecture is David Devant, and the reason I decided on this was because, as Scott mentioned, February the 22nd, 1868 was the year and the date that Devant was born, so I thought it'd be nice to have a sort of 150th celebration of him. Also, I think David Devant is one of those people who everybody's heard of, but maybe perhaps amongst a slightly younger generation, they don't know quite enough about his actual achievements, which is what I wanted to cover particularly this evening. I actually first got interested in Devant when I first became a member of the Magic Circle. I realized he was the president, and that sort of sparked an interest there. But when I started doing my researches generally into magic history, David Devant was somebody who really stood out. In 1990, Sam Sharp produced a book which was called Devant's Delightful Delusions, which is a marvelous compendium of Devant's life, his works, references to plenty of articles and other aspects about his life. And I spent many a happy hour, this is pre-internet days, looking through microfiche to track down some of the original articles. The book was very controversial at the time because he included in the book a review of Devant's show. He'd actually seen Devant perform in 1919, and it was quite a castigating review of his performance. But this is entirely unsurprising if you know about Devant, because by this stage he was extremely ill. I think it's almost certain that he should have retired 2 or 3 years before he did, and 1919 was right at the end of his career. He actually formally retired in 1920. So it was a bit of a scathing review, and I think it was slightly unfair of Sam Sharp not to have made that point, that it really was at the end of his performing life. In 1992, I did a show at the Edinburgh Festival called The Makings of a Magician. I can't say it was an entirely successful show. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say that there were more people in this audience today than there were for the entire 3-week run I had at the Edinburgh Festival. But in that show, I actually drew on various magicians who had inspired me, and one of those was indeed David Devant. So I sort of continued to take an interest in him, and a couple of years ago I was very sort of asked by Highgate Cemetery, which is where Devant's buried, as we'll come to later, asked to do a talk on him there. and that sort of re-inspired my interest in him. So it's on the sort of basis of that talk and the researches which I'd done before that, that this talk is based. Up front, I'm just going to thank just a few people. First of all, I'd like to thank very much David Hibbard. David Hibbard, if you don't know, is the archivist of the Magic Circle. He's got a wonderful collection of photographs and images to do with all magicians, plenty of magicians, and most of the wonderful images which you're going to see during this talk came courtesy of David and the Magic Circle archive. Secondly, I'd like to thank John and Anne Davenport, who are both here this evening. Thank you very much for coming along, and the wonderful Davenport collection. And some of the images, again, are from their collection. Also, I'm very much indebted to Anne, who over the years has given me assistance when I was doing my initial investigation into Devant. And of course, she's written the book called, with John Solis, our ex-secretary, St. George's Hall, which has a lot of information about Devant as well. And finally, I'd like to thank Peter Brunning. Peter Brunning and I have been doing quite a lot of work on Devant's grave. I won't bore you with the details about it, but Peter's also been doing some research and come up with one or two really sort of interesting bits of information which I'll be feeding into this talk. So on with the talk. It is going to be very much a PowerPoint presentation. I do sort of slightly apologize for that, particularly for regular Magic Circle members, because there's been a couple of PowerPoint presentations over the last couple of weeks. But my excuse is that there were so many wonderful images of Devant that it's impossible, I think, really to capture the man without looking at the images. So it's for that reason that I've gone with a PowerPoint presentation. So let's get on with it and start talking about the man who I'm here to talk about, which is, of course, David Devant, as I mentioned, born on the 22nd of February, 1868. And I just thought I would put a few sort of key points forward so that you're aware, hopefully, of why I think he's of potentially great interest. The obvious one, first president of our Magic Circle in 1905. The first magician to appear on a Royal Variety Show, although if you're going to be very pedantic, it was actually called the Music Hall Command Performance, but it was in front of the royalty there, and it was effectively the sort of first Royal Variety performance in which David Devant was asked to appear. Inventor, as we will discover, inventor of many revolutionary illusions, author of some of the best books on magic ever written. I don't think there's any doubt about that. A performing style and approach to publicity that I feel resonates today. A pioneer of early cinema and considered by those who saw him to be the best ever magician. Now, this is always a difficult one. How do you compare sort of chalk and cheese? How can you say that Devant was better than Cardini or better than Horace Golden or better than Paul Daniels? Of course, it's absolutely impossible. It is purely a subjective judgment. It's a game we all like to play, who is the best magician ever. My favorite sort of possibly an apocryphal story, but I like to think it's true, is that the great Dante, in his early days in America, wanted to work in England, and he came over on a ship, and he went straight to the Egyptian Hall to see David Devant perform. And having seen him, he then took the first boat back home, back to America, because he realized there was just no way he could compete with a Devant at that time. As I say, whether that story is true or not, I don't know, but I think it sort of gives perhaps a flavor of how he really was felt then. So as far as the talk is concerned, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be looking at dividing it into sections to make it sort of easy. I find it easy if you sort of do a chronology. So we'll start off with the early years, then the Egyptian Hall years up to 1904. Short section on his animated film, how he got into cinema, the St. George's Hall, up to 1915. Then I'm going to look sort of broadly at some of Devant's tricks and illusions, look at his writings, which I think are really, really important. Devant and the Magic Circle, a sort of short section on that, and then the rather sad final years, the last 21 years of his life. So that's how I'm going to set out the talk. As Scott mentioned, if there are people streaming, please feel free to ask questions, put questions on, and they should come up at the end when I do a question time. And of course, anybody in the audience who've got questions will have a time for questions as well. So we're going to start with the early years. So as I mentioned, Devant born on the February the 22nd, 1868. He was actually born in Junction Road opposite the Boston Arms. This is the Boston Arms, very close to where I live, only about sort of 300 or 400, 500 yards from where I live, actually, just opposite Tufnell Park Tube Station. So that's where Devant was born. He had very little schooling, as far as we know. There's one rather sort of poignant comment in his My Magic Life, his autobiography, where he actually writes that at school, his only comment was that he was called Monkey Face, which suggests that he was sort of rather badly teased at school. So he had very little sort of formal education, and he left school at the age of 12 and had a number of different jobs. But this is his actual birth certificate here, which we can see here, just to highlight there. He was called David, and of course he was christened David Whiten. That's the date of his birth. And his mother was Mary Whiten, and his father was James Whiten. And so he was David Whiten, no other name, just David Whiten. And his father called himself a painter in oils. And effectively, he was a slightly unsuccessful, one suspects, illustrator and painter. He did some illustrations apparently for the Illustrated London News, although we haven't been able to track any of them down because they're sort of anonymous. But also Peter Brunning managed to track down a painting actually that was done by James Whiten, which to me actually doesn't look too bad, but I'm not a great expert on painters, but obviously he wasn't particularly successful at it. So Devant did come from a fairly sort of impoverished background. And as I say, he left school at the age of 12, and he had a number of jobs. One of his jobs was actually a page boy. And for those of you who know about Devant's illusions will know he actually created an illusion later on which was called the New Page, whether that was inspired by his job as a page boy. In this illusion, obviously this isn't Devant in the picture, but he holds this sort of model of a page which is then turned upside down and the box is closed, and when the box is opened up, the man inside the box, thanks to my wonderful technology, is turned upside down. So that was basically the trick of the New Page. Another one of his jobs was working at Euston Station, which is very appropriate because it's just around the corner from here. This is the old facade of Euston Station, which was knocked down dreadfully. And he used to work there going along the train selling chocolate and oranges to the passengers in the train. Now, every job that Devant had, and he had a couple of other jobs as well, he was a telephone operator, he worked for the gas people as well, all seemed to last 2 years. Then after that, Devant used to say, and then I was sacked because I was practicing magic. So essentially that seemed to be what happened. He was obviously pretty obsessed by magic from a fairly early age. We don't really know who his influences were, but he did meet, and he recites this again in his autobiography, a magician he called Great Casper, the court conjurer, who I think was basically just a street magician. And Devant learned quite a lot of tricks from him. Casper obviously saw Devant as a bit of an easy touch, I suspect, and sold him tricks. But then he came up with this wonderful scheme, Casper the court conjurer. He said he knew that Devant had an artist friend, and he said if this artist friend would paint a painting of Casper, he, in turn, would tell Devant all the secrets of magic. Okay, so Devant was very excited by this. It cost him quite a lot to persuade his artist friend to paint the painting, and Casper apparently was very particular. He wanted to have sort of famous people and the royalty in the background. It was a sort of magnificent painting of Casper surrounded by all the celebrities who apparently he performed to. So this was produced. Eventually he was happy with it, and Devant came to see Casper the court conjurer. He sat down at his knee. He said he took out a large notebook and a pencil, and he sat there waiting to be told all the secrets of magic. And Casper sort of laughed, and he said, you can put your notebook away. All you have to do, he said, is buy modern magic. Which you can imagine must have knocked Devant off quite something. But he said, in retrospect, it was actually very good advice. Of course, modern magic came out in 1876, so sort of when Devant would have been 8 years old. So perhaps he sort of learnt a lot from modern magic, and also perhaps from watching other magicians. So Devant, after sort of his series of jobs, then started performing. But he wasn't very successful to begin with. He was desperately trying to get sort of jobs. He was considered too young, he was told, to perform in music hall. He just looked too young. But then he got his break. And all magicians need their break, and they need their 10,000 hours, the chance to be bad. And Devant got his, I just forgot to mention here, of course, he did change his name from David Whiten to David Devant. And the story is that he saw a painting of Goliath, David Devant Goliath. excuse my bad French, David in front of Goliath, and he anglicised Devant to get Devant, and that's apparently the story, how he came up with the name David Devant. But we don't know when that actually occurred, but it must have occurred fairly early on. Because when he did get his break, it was a rather strange break. He was asked if he could basically compare or MC a double act at the time who were known as General and Mrs. Might, and they were called the American Midgets. And their act was basically to be themselves on stage. So they used to walk out, they used to sort of tell anecdotes, they used to ride a bicycle, have a meal, they used to dress up in their wedding dress. Apparently Mrs. Might would come in her wedding dress, and apparently people sat and watched it for a couple of hours. Who says show business wasn't good in the good old days? And Devant's job was to compare this. Basically, his job was to introduce them, tell the audience a little bit about them, and also to give them a break in the middle, presumably to get dressed into the wedding dress or whatever. And to fill in this gap, he had to do, well, he did, basically 10 minutes of magic. And he said very honestly that the people weren't expecting any magic. They come to see General and Mrs. Might, so that when he sort of said, I'm sorry, they're off stage for a minute, but I'm now going to entertain you for 10 minutes with a bit of magic, you can imagine the reception he got. And he said it was a really, really tough crowd. You know, he had to win them over. But he performed with General and Mrs. Might for 2 years, basically sort of twice nightly. And I have a feeling that that's how he sort of developed his style and his performing. He had to come in with an audience who were sort of very antagonistic, weren't expecting magic, and win them over. And I'm sure that was the sort of, as I say, the 10,000 hours that Devant put in order to become good. Thanks to Anne Davenport, actually, we've got this little cutting from the press. This is in 1888 when Devant was performing with General and Mrs. Might, and we can see them here, known as the Royal American Midgets, as they were then, the smallest man and woman alive. And this wonderful bit about Devant here, where we see 10 minutes, Delightful Delusions by Mr. David Devant at each reception. So there we have it. That was what. So David Devant did that for a couple of years, and he basically came back to London and started to, attempt to make it within the sort of London circle. We've got some early images of Devant, which I'm going to show you now. These are sort of early publicity shots, I guess, most of which I suspect he rejected. But we can sort of see him there. Not quite sure what that piece of apparatus is. There he is holding a rabbit up, I think, and this is his famous strangling the rabbits trick. I don't think he's quite got the sort of twinkle in his eye at this stage. He looks like a sort of almost like an axe murderer there, I think, with his two rabbits. It was during the music halls that he met his wife, and he claimed in My Magic Life that he married her at this period. As we will discover, he didn't, but this is what he claimed in My Magic Life, that he met the great pal of his life, who was a music hall person as well, and they married, and obviously she came into the act, as we can see here, with the two of them together. And he was performing sort of on the sort of fringes of London society, I guess. But even then, he was very good at publicising himself. This is a very early poster of Devant. And notice he calls himself the Royal Magician, which of course everybody would assume meant that he performed in front of Queen Victoria. But in actual fact, he performed in front of the Queen of Romania, who happened to be at one of his performances. And he was very honest about this. Again, in My Magic Life, he talks about the fact that he'd sort of, he knew that everybody would think it was a royal Queen Victoria or somebody, but in fact, it's just the Queen of Romania. So he was sort of hovering around, but not really making much of an impact. Which brings us neatly to the next stage of his life, which is the Egyptian Hall. And this hall, Egyptian Hall, was actually founded in 1812. It was built in 1812, and from the very start, it was a hall that was used for both for shows and for talks and for sort of exhibitions. But in 1873, John Neville Maskelyne and George Cook famously leased the Egyptian Hall from 1873 right through to its demise in 1905. And of course, they were the Maskelyne and Cook entertainments. This is an early poster of that. George Cook was very much a backseat person. It was John Neville Maskelyne who was out front. And this was the sort of mecca of magicians at this time, because of course it was the perfect performing environment. People had paid to come and see magic. It was also a very intimate space, surprisingly small actually. I mean, not a great deal bigger than this own theatre, I would have said. This is the outside of the Egyptian hall at this time. This is later on. We can just about make out the Egyptian hall there. And this is the inside. It only seated, you know, sort of 200, 250 people. So it was a very intimate space. And Devant, like most other magicians, wanted to work there. There's a famous story about Harry Houdini applying to work at the Egyptian hall. I think it was the Egyptian hall. It might have been the St. George's Hall, but anyway, to work with Maskelyne and Cook, or Maskelyne and Devant, and he got a rejection letter from John Neville Maskelyne saying, "I'm not interested." So it was a tough gig to break. Was the Egyptian hall. This is the stage, a very small stage. But Devant had come up with an illusion, and he was working this illusion. It was called vice versa. And this is an image of the illusion. Essentially, it's a transformation of a man into a woman. So the man is inside the cabinet. He's tied around with 2 ropes. The cabinet door's closed. When it's opened up, there's a woman there. So it was a vice versa. A good illusion by all accounts. And Devant asked John Neville Maskelyne to come along and see it. Maskelyne was very impressed by it, but he said it was too large to fit on this stage of the Egyptian hall. But if Devant could come up with another illusion, he might be interested in working with him. So this is probably an indication of Devant's genius. Within 5 days, he'd come up with one of the all-time great illusions, which was the artist's dream, which of course is still performed today. I'll talk a little bit later when I get on to Devant's illusions, what exactly Devant's version of the artist's dream was, because it is different from the sort of the conventional one, which you might have seen people like David Copperfield, etc. perform. And this was perfect. It fitted, as you can see, very neatly onto the stage of the Egyptian hall. And he was immediately offered a 3-month contract by Maskelyne, but with the proviso, but he wasn't actually going to perform it. Basically, he got the illusion off Devant, and he had his own team of people, and they worked the illusion, and Devant carried on working outside. But obviously, gradually, Devant infiltrated himself. He came up with another illusion not too long afterwards called the birth of Flora, which was an illusion he did with his wife, whereby she was produced from a bowl of flowers. So he now gradually, over a period, established himself in the Egyptian hall. And of course, this was the absolute perfect vehicle to be working in, because not only would he get work from the Egyptian hall, but because of the name of Maskelyne and Cook, it meant that he could also work outside using the name. And this is an example of a couple of things. So here we've got David Devant's Entertainments direct from Maskelyne and Cook's at the Egyptian hall. So he's not even working at the Egyptian hall at this time. Well, he probably did, but I mean, the point is he's promoting himself on the basis of the Maskelyne and Cook. So that's as big a title as you like as his name. So this enabled him to get a lot of work outside. It also enabled him to do private engagements on the back. This is an early brochure which he did, a rather splendid brochure. I'm just going to pick out a couple of extracts there to give an indication. I'll just read it out. This is Illusions. It says, Mr. Devant is the inventor of the successful mystery vice versa performed at the Crystal Palace, and of the illusionary sketch, The Artist's Dream, which he presented twice daily at the Egyptian hall. So he's promoting himself very much there. He's also basically saying that he's open to engagements, can accept private engagements at hours that will not interfere with his appearance at the Egyptian hall. So once again, there's a trade-off there. And then this rather splendid little comment here, which I'm not quite sure what it means. But he says, Mr. Devant's seances are eminently suitable for drawing rooms, as he does not require any special arrangement and uses no objectionable apparatus. Whatever that objectionable apparatus was, I don't know. He probably wasn't doing the bra trick, is probably the answer. So this is Devant in his early days at the Egyptian hall. Very successful there. And we now have a little bit of a hiatus for Devant when in his interest in film. And Devant, in 1896, the Lumiere brothers came over with their representative, who was Truey, and showed the first animated picture in London. And Devant saw an early screening, was very excited by it, and he thought that this would be the perfect thing to show at the Egyptian hall. And he went to John Neville Maskelyne and said, look, he would be able to hire a projector for £100. And John Neville Maskelyne wasn't interested. He said, this is going to be a 9-day wonder, forget about it. So, but Devant was still sort of keen on promoting himself or finding out about it. So he met up, this is the original Lumiere poster, but here he met up with this man, Robert Paul. Robert Paul was a pioneer of early film in England, and he built a projector, and he said he would sell one to Devant for £100. So rather than having to lease one from the Lumiere brothers, Devant could actually buy one outright for £100. He went back to John Neville Maskelyne and said, look, I've got this great deal, why don't we give it a go? John Neville Maskelyne, very sceptical still, said, look, I'll tell you what, I will give you £5 a month just as a sort of ongoing contract, but I expect it to be sort of finished in a couple of months, but I'll give it a go. And of course, it was an instantaneous success and remained in the Egyptian Hall for many years afterwards. This is the original camera projector in the Egyptian Hall. And it was there right until almost the end. This is, as we can see in this picture, which I showed you earlier, we've actually got animated photographs. So basically, you're promoting the animated photographs as much as you are promoting the magic itself. It's hard from us to sort of experience, why people would have been that excited by animated pictures. But there's this wonderful extract. I'm just going to read it very quickly. This came from Fred Coulpit. It was written in the Magic Circular about Neville Maskelyne on his death. It was Fred Coulpit on Great Magicians I Have Known. And he just captures, I think, why it is that people were quite excited, or how the Egyptian Hall made it into quite a presentation of early films. He writes as follows: when showing the newly discovered wonder, he, i.e. Neville Maskelyne, invested his presentation with erudite references and scholarly explanations, which made the exhibition amusing and convincing without being boring. He had a trick of shooting forth a coiled roll of film, just as the average conjurer flings upwards a roll of silk and ribbon, and he would patter interestingly on the number of separate pictures on a foot of celluloid. It was all very fascinating in those days. Then Neb would snap his fingers, out would go the lights, and the screen would be filled with heavy seas tumbling over rocks, soldiers marching in Cairo, or jerky pedestrians crossing unsteady streets in a perpetual rain of black spots. A wonderful piece of writing by Fred Coulpit, I think, and I think it really sort of captures why people were, excited about animated pictures at the Egyptian Hall. Now, Devant, being very shrewd, having bought a projector for the Egyptian Hall, he then bought one for himself, and he started doing personal engagements, apparently at £25 a time, astronomical amount of money. And this is him sort of advertising himself here. So Mr. David Devant, the magic's almost sort of forgotten about here. It's all the films which he's showing for private viewings. And at the weekend, he used to go over to Paris and buy films from Georges Méliès, the great filmmaker. So Devant was very instrumental in making films himself. He made a couple of films himself. He filmed a Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And he also, as I say, went out and bought films. And he also bought cameras and sold them to other magicians as well. So he was probably making a huge amount of money from this. But there came a stage when he presumably had to decide, what was his first love? Was it going to be basically a sort of a cinema man, or was it magic? And it came back eventually to magic, which is when we come to St. George's Hall, because in 1905, the Egyptian Hall was demolished. And John Neville Maskelyne was looking around for new premises, and he came up with the Egyptian Hall, which is used to be in Langham Place, where the old BBC was, and he found this premises and he leased that. So this was a new hall. This is a picture of it here. You can just about make out Maskelyne, and I don't know if that says Devant or Cook actually, but Maskelyne's anyway, St. George's Hall. And this is the interior of St. George's Hall. Now, it was quite a bit bigger than the Egyptian Hall. It seated like sort of 550 compared to like sort of around 250. So it was a more financially risky venture. They had to fill more people. And John Neville Maskelyne said he thought he would start with a big bang. And he made possibly the biggest mistake of his career, because his big bang was a book by a man called Edward Lytton Bulwer, known as The Coming Race. It's about a person who finds a sort of alien race underground, and it's a story about him meeting up with these people, interacting with them, and then coming back to the surface. But it involves sort of a lot of sort of special effects, and John Neville Maskelyne thought that this would be the perfect opening for the St George's Hall. Unfortunately, the audience did not agree with him, and it was from the very beginning a bit of a failure, and it was hemorrhaging money as well. It cost an awful lot. After 8 weeks, John Neville Maskelyne was forced to close it, and he was in desperate measures by now. Although he made a lot of money with Egyptian Hall, he'd sunk it all into this venture, and he appealed to David Devant, who was touring around very successfully doing the sort of Maskelyne and Cook magic shows, and asked him to come back to London and basically save St George's Hall. And Devant did on April the 22nd. He opened with the conventional back to the old magic show called A Feast of Magic, and David Devant was starring in it. But the price that Devant demanded for this, one sort of assumes, was that he would become a partner with Maskelyne, and then it became Maskelyne and Devant. And of course, this was the absolute key to Devant's subsequent career and his money making very successfully, because now he could perform. David Devant there, but he's under the banner of Maskelyne and Devant. It also meant that when he wasn't even there at the Egyptian Hall, his name was still up there in lights, Maskelyne Devant, so he's not even performing, but there it is. And of course, when he went out on tour, away from the Egyptian Hall, David Devant, and he could just promote Maskelyne and Devant. So basically, he was getting the name, whatever he did, essentially, whether he was working at the St George's Hall or not. I'm actually going to take this opportunity also to show Devant's posters are absolutely wonderful. There's wonderful examples of it. I'm just going to show a collection of 3 which I really, really like, which is all with the same one of I have seen David Devant. So this gentleman here, I've seen David Devant. And then there's this one as well, with that rather amusing person squirting, and probably the best one, which was used on the back of John Fisher's In the Story of Magic, where he substituted I've seen Paul Daniels for that one. So very innovative with his posters as well. This is a sort of modern, very much a sort of modern design, I like to think. So why was Devant so good, or was he so good, is the question. I've sort of tried to analyse it, why I think he was as good as perhaps contemporaries said he was. I think one of the reasons was that he had one of those people who really could do both the illusions and the small magic. I mean, if we take the American perspective, we've got the brilliant illusionist David Copperfield, who's perhaps not quite so good with the sort of audience participation comedy bit. And then we have our Paul Daniels, of course, the late lamented Paul Daniels, who was absolutely brilliant at the audience participation, small magic, perhaps not quite so good with the big illusions. But I think David Devant was somebody who really could do both. I mean, if you just look at these photographs, I think it's just a sort of wonderful illusion there, the sort of the stillness of it and the way he looks, and also with the sort of the smaller magic. So somehow I think he could put them both together and really come out from, out in front of the audience because of that. And of course, he had this wonderful motto, which I titled my lecture, "All done by kindness" as well. So that, I think it's all that which sort of comes together in making David Devant what he was. But just to look at some specific illusions which he came up with, this is the artist's dream, the one which I mentioned earlier about him coming up in 1893. It did evolve over the years, but the final actual production of it was quite a complicated illusion. Basically what happened, you had the artist, who would have been played by David Devant, and he was painting a picture of his dead wife, and then he covers the easel with a cloth, and he lies down on a couch and looks like he falls asleep. And then a spirit of mercy emerges, a woman emerges, and she removes the cover from the easel, and the widow, or the dead wife, steps out from the easel, goes down to the couch where Devant is and gives him a sort of embrace, and then she steps back up into the easel. At which point, the artist, David Devant, wakes up, and he sort of rushes forward, and he sees the spirit of mercy, and he goes towards the spirit of mercy to embrace her or to grab hold of her, and as he puts his hands around her, she vanishes. And then, Devant concludes, the artist falls dead on the stage. So a rather more sort of dramatic finish than contemporary recreations of that trick, where the artist is very much alive at the end. So a very sort of relatively complicated piece involving this spirit of mercy. But the great thing about the spirit of mercy was that this combined his trick in later years with the mascot moth, which was the vanish of a woman on stage without any cover, considered perhaps to be one of the hardest illusions ever created and ever performed. Now we have got some pictures, rather bizarre looking pictures, but here it is. This is the spirit of mercy emerging with Devant lying on the couch. He's then sort of approaching her, as you can see, without any cover, and she instantly sort of fades away. You can see, so obviously that's a sort of a bit of a photograph trick there, but she fades away. But essentially that was the trick. The Devant would literally come towards her, start to embrace her, and she would just vanish away. The trick has been recreated by Jim Steinmeier. He said how difficult it was. I mean, it's fairly obvious that it's a trap door involved, but obviously there's far more to it than that, because you've got the costume that the woman is wearing. It's a sort of Dakota type costume that has to drop down through the trap door, and the the instant timing of it and everything was really, really complicated. Neville Maskelyne, who knew a lot about illusion, said it was the trickiest illusion which he had ever seen. But it's just a sort of wonderful example of Devant coming up with this sort of on-stage complete disappearance of a woman. Another trick which I particularly like, which again I've never seen this performed, called Beau Brocade. This involved a woman coming on and dressed like the Scarlet Pimpernel for some bizarre reason, and she was hypnotized by Devant. She fell on the floor, and she was wrapped up in a cloth on the floor, and two assistants picked her up and put her in Devant's arms. Devant, she was obviously shown to the audience, everybody could see her. And then what happened was that Devant approached towards, he actually walked out into the audience, right into the footlights of the audience, and then suddenly he would just slam, the cloth shut, he would toss it to one side, the woman instantly disappeared and then reappeared in a box which had previously been shown empty. And if you read about the illusion, it's probably one that probably wouldn't work today, because it did involve a dummy head. It was a switch of the woman on the as she lay down on the carpet. A very complicated switch, actually, not much sort of more detailed than you might think. It's not an easy thing to do. And obviously he had the dummy head. He had to sort of act that he was holding a live woman. I think possibly with the bright lights of today that it'd be quite hard to get away with a dummy head as you walk towards the audience. But an amazing illusion that really would have blown people away, I think. An illusion which is still performed today, Biff, rather bizarre name for the vanishing motorbike. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, familiar with this trick where the person rides into a box which is drawn up on stage, and then in an instant it vanishes. We've got a couple of old photographs. I love these photographs. This isn't Devant performing it, obviously. This one I like in particular, with the dramatic pose of the magician there pointing. I think this is John Warren, I think, performing that, and we haven't got the actual vanish. But Richard Cadell is one person I saw do it. So a trick which is still performed today. So these were his he invented many other illusions, great illusions, but I just sort of pick out sort of three which I think are particularly impressive for differing reasons. When it came to the small magic, I guess his most famous trick is the egg trick, a boy, a girl, and some eggs, as it was called. Now, when Devant did the Royal Command Music Hall performance, this is the trick he performed on it. It was a very long show. There were 24 different artists, but Devant chose to do a boy, a girl, and some eggs. And he actually chose his daughter, Vida, and the son of Neville Maskelyne, who was Jasper Maskelyne. And this is a photograph of the trick. It was basically very simple. Devant would show a bowler hat, empty, obviously, and he would reach up and he would produce an egg from the hat, which he would hand to the girl. The girl would hand it to the boy. The boy would hold the eggs on his arm. And then, of course, Devant would quicken up faster and faster and faster. He would be supposedly not aware that the boy's eggs were coming too much, and they would start falling onto the ground. So you can imagine how much sort of humor that would generate from that. And Devant apparently handled the boy and the girl absolutely brilliantly. He used to play the wedding march as they came up on stage, and his rapport with the children was excellent. I don't think it was too successful at this particular command performance, because apparently his daughter and Jasper had seen the trick perhaps performed quite a few times and weren't really interested in it, and they spent most of their time gazing up at the royal couple. So there's a bit of a lesson for you there, I think. Another trick which Devant is well known for, sorry, I'm just showing the eggs there, fairly obvious. Just in case you hadn't guessed. Sometimes you can get carried away with PowerPoint, can't you? Let's be honest. So there is the young Vida and Jasper. And there's a very famous trick, the obliging kettle. We actually had a talk on this last week by Jez Rose, all about the magic kettle. And Devant actually, as far as we know, came up with the idea, although Henry Bate, his great sort of his inventor, the sort of Jim Steinmeier, I guess, of Devant's time, sort of invented the apparatus of the magic kettle, any drink called for as a version of it. And of course, Paul Daniels performed that famously on his own show. Had a great opening line to this. David Devant would say, there's a story attached to this trick as well as a spout and a handle. I really think that's a nice little sort of opening there. There'll be more of Devant. Another reason why I'm a huge fan of Devant is that I feel his patter or his script is actually quite contemporary. I'll give a couple of other examples later on. In fact, coming up now in his writings. So Devant's writings, he did a lot. His very first little write was a fairly rare book, I guess, called Hand Shadows. It was only 8 pages long. If you remember this poster from earlier, he used to do shadowgraphy. So that was one of his things he did. And this one was actually written in 1901. As I say, only 8 pages long, little booklet, pamphlet of, and there's a sort of opening page of Devant with the hand shadows. His next couple of books were written in 1903. This one's Magic Made Easy. These books were produced with very sort of cheap paper, and I've yet to find a good copy of either this or Woes of the Wizard, which you'll be seeing in a moment. Very sort of cheap paper, it's all sort of browns and the spine collapses. This is my copy of it, but this is the copy of the first edition, but it was then made into a later edition in about 1921, I think. This is the revised edition. Having said it was revised edition meant that actually they dropped 2 chapters from the original. So downwardly revised, I think, is probably a more accurate. And those 2 chapters are excellent. They're a sort of introductory chapter and Devant's philosophy on magic. So the first edition is better than the later edition. And in the same year, he wrote Woes of a Wizard, which is a sort of cross between a sort of early autobiography and a book of anecdotes. This is the hardback version. This is the paperback version. Again, really hard to find a good version of this. The hardback, obviously, slightly easier. Although these books are probably the rarest of Devant's own books. Written in 1903, so he was still at the Egyptian Hall, and it's an amazingly sort of confessional book. And he actually admits at one point in the book that people think that I do magic for the love of entertaining my audience. Nonsense, I do it for the money. Which is a sort of bizarre thing to say when you're, at the height of your fame. But that's what he says in the book. I don't know how much truth there was in it, but anyway, there he goes. Got to take his word for it. He was in it for the money. And why not? His next book, Tricks for Everyone, which was written in 1910. John Neville Maskelyne was rather rude about this book, but it was basically aimed at the general public. Wonderful photographs in it. Again, a lot of Devant books had all these photographs, so he really is photographing, doing all the actions. And I'm also going to show you a trick now with the book. If you look at the moustache on the front, later editions, the moustache disappears. It was actually about 1910 that apparently he shaved off his moustache. And obviously for later books, they decided to reproduce it without the moustache. So a little bit of Photoshop there in 1910. To some degree, perhaps it's slightly unfair, but I have a feeling that Devant's sort of golden era was perhaps from around about 1895 to around about 1910. and somehow sort of pre-moustache or post-moustache era, perhaps, and maybe not such the great years. I think the really great years for Devant was probably up to around about 1910, 1911. That's my own sort of supposition anyway. Our Magic. I hope everybody's got a copy of this book in your library. Shame on you if you haven't. Our Magic, one of the really great textbooks, I think, on magic, but also one of the most complex ones. It's like the PhD in magic, I think, to a certain extent. It used to be sold at St. George's Hall. Goodness knows what sort of 8-year-old grandsons would have thought when they were given a copy of Our Magic, written by Neville Maskelyne and David Devant, as we can see in the title. There's 3 sections to it. 2 sections are written by Neville Maskelyne, the art in magic and the, the theory of magic. But the 3rd section, which is the great section, is the practice of magic by David Devant. So Neville Maskelyne got off on theory, very learned articles on theory, very good articles, some of it, but a bit heavy, it must be said, a bit heavy going and controversial as well, some of it. But Devant completely ignored all that, and he just basically divulged great tricks, which he did. And he divulges them in absolute detail, wonderful photographs, giving all the presentation and how he did it. It is an absolute masterclass in studying magic, complete with photographs, just a few here. My own favorite trick is called the Forgotten Guest, which is basically a sort of smashed watch routine. And he includes in that, the breaking of a watch. He gets a little boy up, and he includes a little electric chair section in it as well. And he reproduces all his patter as well. And this is my sort of, I'm going to just show you 3 lines which Devant used, which I think would fit in with any performer today in a family audience. So he says, I want a boy to help me, just an ordinary boy. I don't want a boy over 50. Now, do you mind acting as a committee of 1? Will you do everything I ask? How nice to have a committee that does all you ask. And this is my favorite. You really need not be nervous. I performed this experiment some hundreds of times, and I've killed only 1 boy. He died, but he was only a very small boy. And I've seen that reproduced, but they miss out the final line. That's the funny line, He died, but he was only a small boy, very small boy. It's a perfect line. And, there's other lines in Devant which I think are still used today. And if you compare it with other scripts of other magicians at the time, if you look at the scripts which appear in Will Goldston's many books and journals, they're completely unreadable, dreadful, full of horrible puns. But Devant, you can really see a very contemporary writer. And I think, to me, that captures him almost sort of better. The lines and the patter captures him better than his illusions. There's a story about J. Marshall because Our Magic was reproduced by Dover Publications, and they reproduced the first 2/3 of the book, which was a section by Neville Maskelyne. And there's a story about J. Marshall, when he owned his magic shop, receiving a box load of these books. So he opened up the case, took out Our Magic, had a flick through it, chucked it to one side, and he said they reproduced the wrong part of the book. So that's what he thought, and he's quite right. It's the Devant part, which is the master class. That's the bit you really want to read, rather than Neville Maskelyne's rather heavy theory. So 1911, one of the great books in magic. A couple of other books which he wrote after he retired. Lessons in Conjuring. This has got this famous statement about a young boy coming up to him and saying he does magic. Devant says, how many tricks do you do? And the young lad says 300. And Devant says, well, that's very impressive. I only do 8. And of course, we know what the lesson to be learned from that is. And it was discovered actually by my friend David Britland, but that young magician was in fact Fred Coulpit. Fred Coulpit, who later would work at the St. George's Hall himself, and who I quoted from the obituary of Neville Maskelyne. So Fred Coulpit was the young boy who Devant made that statement to, because Devant actually says, and now he's grown up, he learned from what I said, and he's a great magician himself. So Lessons in Conjuring, written in 1922, the best tricks and how to do them. 1931, if you are a collector, you will of course have the paperback version, and if you're an obsessive, sad collector, you'll have the red version as well as the green version of the paperback edition. I'm not saying that I do have them, but I do. David Devant autobiography, written in 1931. Again, this was 11 years after he retired. Introduction by J.B. Priestley, so it sort of shows his sort of standing, if you like. A great autobiography, some wonderful stories in it. Unfortunately, it's quite hard to know which stories are true and which stories are not true. Frank White, the ex-president of the Magic Circle, who was a pupil of David Devant, particularly praised Devant for one story about him, a lunatic, as they called the men, escaped from the asylum, and Devant he did the miser's dream until he came along and was captured. So what a wonderful story that was, and Devant had to admit that he'd made it up. So, but a lot of it is true. You can sort of pick out the bits which I think are true, and the autobiographical stuff which is true. Very revealing, I think. This book, as I say, was written in 1931, and from 1913 to 1931, this is how much Devant writes about in the book. And I think this will be reflected in his final years, which I'll be coming to in a moment. And the final book he wrote, and this, along with Our Magic, is his masterpiece, Secrets of My Magic, written in 1936, where Devant reveals the secrets of nearly all of his illusions. Jim Steinmuir again said there were 4 great books on magic illusions. Robert Harbin's book, Hopkins, Magic by Hopkins, then there's Jarrett's Magic, and the 4th one was Secrets of My Magic. And Devant, in literally a very short paragraph, tells you the secrets and the real secrets behind things like the mascot's moth, the artist's dream, and others of his tricks. It's so brilliantly, succinctly written, but you really have to be an illusionist to even sort of be able to understand what he's writing. It's really, really unbelievably brilliant book. So Secrets of Magic, what can I say? Well, one of, as I say, along with Our Magic, probably Devant's masterpiece, in which David Devant genuinely does reveal his famous illusions. Again, goodness knows what the general public would have made of that when they bought it. There it is, that's the frontispiece of the book. So moving on, Devant and the Magic Circle. Here I am at the Magic Circle. David Devant was, of course, our first president. When the Magic Circle was founded in 1905, there was only one man who could possibly be asked to be president, and that was David Devant. This is wonderful sort of male-dominated pictures here. Yes, how much has changed? I don't know, hopefully a bit, but the sort of wonderful confidence, self-confidence of the men, and I love Devant's centre stage there, very much the sort of master there of the president, and another one attempting to be a little bit informal. I'm not sure if wholly succeeding, hanging on to every word, or any word that Devant is writing even. Devant only lasted a year as a president. He then stepped down because of other duties, and Neville Maskelyne took over as president, and we have a slightly later image there. Devant obviously now must have been after 1910 because he's lost his moustache, and there's Neville and John Neville there. Neville, of course, John Neville Maskelyne's son. So Neville Maskelyne as the president back then. Of course, we can't possibly mention David Devant and the Magic Circle without admitting that he is, as far as I'm aware, the only magician to be chucked out of the Magic Circle, not once but twice. So even in this misdemeanor, Devant is absolutely top dog. The first time he was chucked out was for Tricks for Everyone, that was published in 1910. But in 1909, to promote the book, a series of articles appeared in a journal. And of course, as it was back then, as it is now indeed, if you produce magic in a journal which can be read by anybody and they're not specifically buying it from magic, then that is a misdemeanor and a kickable, outable offence. And Devant was indeed kicked out. It didn't last very long. He was back within a few months. But more controversially, in 1936, when he produced Secrets of My Magic, and you must remember at this time Devant was very ill, as we will discover, an article appeared in the Royal Windsor magazine, which again was an extract from the book. It was called Illusion and Disillusion. And again, because of this misdemeanor, he was kicked out. Devant's argument was that he was revealing his own illusions. He did reveal a lot of his own illusions, but he also, to be fair, did reveal some sort of more basic principles. But he was kicked out, but he was apparently secretly told by Frank White that he would be sort of got back in again after he'd done his time. And a year or so later, he was brought back in as an honorary life member, so could not actually be kicked out again. But there we are, Devant, our president, removed from the Magic Circle, not once but twice. Of course, we don't talk about that much now, in public anyway. He is absolutely our number one person. This is the Devant room for people who perhaps are watching on the stream who are not familiar with our club room. And center stage, we have a statue of David Devant. Now, I must admit, when I saw this statue, I was slightly surprised because this looks like to be the multiplying egg routine. And as I'm sure most of you know, there was, as far as I'm aware, not really a multiplying egg routine, it's a multiplying billiard balls. So it did rather surprise me that the sculptor had actually gone for this. And then I discovered in David Hibberd's archive this picture. So we can tell exactly where she got the image from. I must admit, and perhaps this is slightly sacrilege, but I'm not too keen on the image myself. I think he looks too old there. This is Devant in his sort of prime with the moustache, and I think she sort of makes him look a bit too old for my liking. But anyway, there he is, Devant, with the, that's where the picture came from to do the statue. And of course we have the Devant Award, the international award, so that goes to any international magician. So the likelihood of me getting that is probably unlikely. So that's the highest award that you can possibly be given in the Magic Circle. A few years ago, he was given a blue heritage, English heritage blue badge where he lived in Ormond Mansions in London. So there he is up there. So he's now sort of acknowledged by people generally with that. And of course, when we had the centenary of the Magic Circle and we had the first aid cover stamps, Devant was very much featured on there. Sorry, I've gone a bit too far with that rather wonderful picture. So very much Devant at the forefront of the Magic Circle. So I now come to the final part of this talk, which is the final years. And it is a rather sad story, really. Basically, the story goes that Devant was performing around about sort of 1919, and he had a young lad up on stage with him, and he asked the young lad to sort of copy everything he did. And they both had a handkerchief, so the young Devant took a handkerchief out of his pocket, the young lad did the same, Devant sort of shook it around a little bit, the young lad did the same, then Devant held it still like this, and the young lad started going like that. And Devant couldn't understand why he was doing that, looked down at his own hand and discovered it was shaking. And that sort of precipitated his retirement. I suspect that that is an apocryphal story. I think from readings that Devant was probably ill as early as 1916. They talk about him sort of taking extended holidays, because of his illness and having to come away from the St. George's Hall. He actually left the partnership with Maskelyne in 1915. And I suspect, again, there might have been an element of ill health in that sort of parted the ways there. So I think that Devant was ill possibly from sort of 1916 onwards. And I suspect that he, of course, forced to retire completely in 1920, but probably should have stopped performing quite a bit before that. So unfortunately, sadly, he had to stop performing in 1920. I mentioned earlier about Devant's writings, and he sort of earned a little bit of a living after he'd retired by writing a number of articles for magazines like the Strand magazine. So he sort of eked out a little bit of a living doing that. This is an article about the Christmas Conjurer. And this rather splendid article called Tricks I Should Like to Do. And Devant basically writes an article about tricks he would like to do. And he just gives the effect, he doesn't give the method, which is probably useful given that this trick is a big box, a band box, and you open it up and an entire orchestra step out of it. So, yeah, possible, I guess. And the other one where he rolls up a cone, a piece of paper, and produces a ball out of it, or several large balls. So Devant sort of just talks about tricks that he would like to do in these articles. Another article he did was a rather interesting puzzle story. So in the first installment, the readers were set a puzzle and about the terrible aunt, and then there was a solution of David Devant's problem story. So that was a way, as I say, he sort of made a little bit of money. His personal life. I mentioned earlier about Devant claiming to have been married in sort of 1888 when he was probably touring around with General and Mrs. Might. He did meet his to-be wife then, but they did not actually marry until 1904. And this piece of evidence was actually discovered by Peter Brunning. Took an awful lot of research to find the marriage certificate of Devant. So as far as I'm aware, this is the first time this has actually been shown. But we can see it here in 19th July 1904, David Whiten married to Anne Marion there. He's considered to be an entertainer. But what's interesting here, she is a widow. And that is the reason they didn't marry before, but she was already married and she had to wait until her husband died before they could have a marriage. So that, we assume, must be the reason her husband died in 1904. They were obviously separated from the time that Devant and her met. It was also around about this time that Devant had, the two Devants had their daughter, Vida Devant. And despite an awful lot of searching, both by Peter and also by Anne Davenport as well, never been able to find the birth certificate for Vida Devant. And the theory is perhaps that she was adopted. And this would sort of make sense as well about them getting married. They needed to get married in order to have the adoption coming through. Because, as I say, there were no birth certificate for Vida. She just appears. And interestingly, Devant in My Magic Life, although he mentions his wife, he doesn't mention his daughter at all, which you would have thought, you know, the birth of my daughter or something would have popped up at some point. So one suspects that that might well be true, that theory. Unfortunately, there's no way we can substantiate that. But that's the feeling, that Vida Devant was possibly adopted. We can actually see her sort of growing up. This is a Christmas card, which would have been soon after she arrived on the scene, whether born or adopted, about 1906. This is here, Devant in 1912, at the Royal Command Music Hall performance. So we can see Vida on the left there. This is a Christmas card in 1919-1920. And this, if you like, is my evidence of how ill Devant must have been when he retired. This is about the time he retired. Look at his face there, if you compare him with the earlier pictures. But there's the Vida, and there she is, a young woman. Vida, although she did marry, sadly died without any children. So the line, if you like, the David Devant direct line came to an end, although he did have a brother who had children, and there were still relatives of them around. So that was Vida Devant. How about his wife? Well, sadly, she died in 1928. Here we see, age 63 years old, the wife of David Devant, a conjurer, now retired. And a rather sad little message here. She died of pneumonia and chronic alcoholism. And again, this might sort of, you know, show a behind-the-scenes story about what was happening with, you know, Devant had to retire in 1920, the collapse of his career. You know, there's a lot you can sort of read into that. We don't know is the answer, but Vida Devant was his daughter. So what happened to Devant himself? Well, he retired. He basically, he suffered from paralysis, which gradually got worse. This is the last sort of picture of him outside a hospital, taken in 1931, surrounded by a group of magicians. There he is in his chair. And rather sort of sad picture again, if you compare it with the early pictures. And this is Secrets of My Magic, written in 1936, if you remember. This is the flyer for the book. And I will just read this about it. It says, the author is now an invalid, and this book was written under the utmost difficulty while he was in bed or in a bath chair. It was dictated from memory and notes to his friend, W.F. Curtis. W.F. Curtis was Devant's nurse, basically from sort of 1925 onwards, nursed Devant right through to his end, and became his sort of secretary. And as you say, Devant dictated his book to William Curtis. So he ended up, sadly, in the Royal Hospital for the Incurables, that wonderful name which they liked to use back then, which he arrived in 1936, and he remained there till his death. This is one of the later pictures. This is surrounded by magicians because, having discovered that Devant was in the hospital, a group of magicians, orchestrated, I think, by Frank White, who was David Devant's pupil, put together annual shows at the hospital and in sort of honor of Devant on his birthday, as you can see, 24th of February, around his birthday, 22nd of February, and Devant there arranging the entertainment and Magic Circle members entertained Devant and the staff and the patients at the hospital. And this actually continued after Devant's death for a period as well. So there we have it. And eventually he died in 1941, which we can see here. This is his death certificate, 13th of October 1941. And he died of paralysis agitans, which is a form of paralysis which is normally a name for Parkinson's, some sort of Parkinson's type disease that he had and gradually got worse over some 15, 20 years. And he is, of course, before I do, this is the obituary that appears in the Times newspaper, which I tracked down pre-internet days, which is why it's a rather odd copy. But I just wanted to read out the bottom bit actually here that says, his place as a magician can, however, be asserted only by the few experts who constitute the inner circle of the mystery. I guess that's us. And there is no doubt as to the high position which those experts would assign to him. Some among them hold that he was not only the prime conjurer of his day, but the foremost magician of all time. And that's actually quoted, I think, in Morburns' Christopher book about him being, the Times newspaper writes that he was the greatest magician of all times. Well, there is a slight equivocal to that about saying he was not a, but anyway, that's where that sort of quote comes from, which you see in Morburns Christopher's book on the history of magic. And he is buried at Highgate Cemetery, which is here. I'm going to give a quick plug here. I have mentioned it on Facebook, but this is to say that tomorrow morning I am organising a little expedition to Highgate Cemetery. We're meeting at Highgate Cemetery at 10:45, just outside the main gates here, to come and see Devant's grave. Also, I should mention that Colonel Stodare and Carlton, two other very famous English magicians, are buried there as well, and we'll probably have a chance to see their gravestones as well. So if anyone's interested, have a chat with me or email me. I apologise to you in America. I don't think you'll be able to make it quite in time, now that Concorde is no longer in operation. But 10:45 tomorrow morning outside Highgate Cemetery, if you would like to come and see Devant's grave. Devant's grave sort of is in charge, the man in charge of the grave at the moment is David Burglas, under the Magic Circle sort of memorial initiative, who was responsible sort of looking after it. David sort of apologised that he couldn't make it here this evening. He very much like to, and apologised that he can't make it tomorrow because of his, he's hard to walk at the moment. But anyway, I'd just like to mention David by name there. So there we have it. That is as succinct a story I can give of Devant. I hope it's captured to most of you. Those of you familiar, I hope it sort of brings back memories that you're aware of, and those of you perhaps unfamiliar realise why I think he's held in such great esteem and why we are indeed very much privileged to have him as our first and, I think, greatest president of the Magic Circle. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. That was extraordinarily succinct and well-researched, and I thought I knew Devant really well, and I learned a considerable amount. And the other thing is that magic history can tend to be pretty dry, but that wasn't dry. That was really entertaining as being really well informed. So thank you very much, Ian. Now, hopefully this is the slightly terrifying thing, is that have we got any questions via the internet? So,
well, yes, what we're going to do is we're going to open up questions both to the internet and to people in the room. So we'll see how we get on. I have about sort of 5 or 10 minutes of question. I have got a question from the internet here. And the question is, did Devant and Maskelyne maintain their close friendship until the end of their lives? I think there might be a wry smile from Anne. I can't, where is Anne and oh, right at the back, right, and John as well. The answer is sadly no. They did rather fall out. This is all actually related in and John Sleece's excellent book about the St. George's Hall. Basically, we're not quite sure why necessarily the partnership had to split up. There was an argument that Devant was sort of spending too much time sort of working the music halls and earning money and not bringing enough money back to St George's Hall. I suspect also that there was an element of illness involved in that, and that sort of perhaps led to a bit of acrimony. But obviously what they had to do was they had to work out a financial deal, and that's when it started becoming quite acrimonious, I think. There was a couple of sort of rather sad pointers with John Neville Maskelyne having a bit of a go at Devant. So whether they actually made it up later, I'm going to ask Anne actually, because she might know about that. As far as I...
I'm not aware that they made up later. They parted company in 1915 and John Neville died in 1917. I think there wasn't time. But John Neville was a first-class hater.
I'm just going to relay that back to people if they not catch it on the streaming. Anne said that as far as she was aware, Devant and Maskelyne didn't make it up because they parted company in 1915. John Neville Maskelyne died in 1917. And Anne has just said that John Neville Maskelyne was a first-class hater, which is a nice little phrase, I think. So, yes, he held grudges. Is that fair to say, Anne? Perhaps. Anyway, so no, sadly, they didn't make it up. So hope that answers that question. Mark.
Ian, close to the beginning, you referenced the fact that David had to get an artist friend to paint the guy who was going to reveal all the secrets to him by subsequently telling him about Hoffman's magic. Why did Devant have to get an artist friend? Why didn't he go to his father? Obviously, you don't know the answer to that question, but it just occurred to me when you were...
So I'm going to repeat back because I think because of the streaming, you might not be able to hear the voices. Mark has asked when he was asked by Casper, the court magician, to paint a picture, why didn't he use his father? I'm not quite sure when his father died, actually. Do you know, Peter? Peter Brunning? I don't. I mean, I do. No, we're not quite sure when he died, so I'm not quite sure if he was alive then, so that is the answer, I don't know. But you don't want to rely on your dad, do you? You go out and do your own stuff.
But you said it was very expensive, wasn't it?
I did say it was very expensive, yeah. This is Devant's story, of course, so we're not quite sure how much of it is sort of true. I think it's probably a true story, but yeah. Good question. Have I got any other questions on here? No. Brian at the back, yeah, I'll just take...
Ian, you showed a number of those very famous Devant posters, and of course some of them actually, the original artwork is shown here in the building. The number that you showed, most of them were by John Hassell. John Hassell was a very popular graphic artist, illustrator and cartoonist at the time. Do you know why he chose John Hassell? Was there anything particular about their relationship, or was it just the idea to get a popular artist to make him more popular?
Yeah, I'll just repeat the question. Brian's asked if I have any idea why David Devant went for John Hassell. John Hassell. As you can see, as I'm fumbling over the name, but I've got absolutely no idea whatsoever. Paul Keeve, I see, is in the audience here. He's a bit of an expert on posters. Any idea, Paul? I'm afraid not. Well, if Paul doesn't know, then John or Anne, you know. John Hassell, yes. And no, the answer is we haven't got a clue.
One of the interesting things about those posters, we used to have the All Done by Kindness poster in the Devant room, is the one that shows him addressing the audience, which is such a brilliantly clever idea because you see the laughing audience in full enjoyment, but you actually see Devant back.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I did show that during the thing. I did go through these images quite fast, but yes, All Done with Kindness is one of the great Devant posters, as you say, with his back to the audience. Precursor to David Blaine, if you like, realizing that what's important is the audience's reaction rather than necessarily the magician doing the tricks. Yeah. Andrew.
How successful were the books outside the magic community?
How successful were the books outside the magic community? I don't know. I mean, I know Our Magic was apparently, volumes of it were sitting in St George's Hall for many, many years afterwards, unsurprisingly, I suspect. I guess he must have been quite popular. I mean, the fact that he was published in 1922 and 1931, and again, 1931, 1936, so sort of three or four books after he you know, after he'd retired effectively, so the name still must have meant something. I mean, when he died, he left £222 in his estate, which in today's money, I don't know, a few thousand. And given that he, you know, hadn't worked for 21 years and had been looked after by Will Curtis, means that I think he was probably quite a wealthy man, you know, whether he made much from the books. But again, I don't know, no. There's a lot of I don't know in these answers. So, Paul? Yeah, I'll go Paul. Yeah.
You may not know this, but I wondered whether...
I don't know.
I'm curious about the story about David Devant and where that story is written, because I went to look for it recently. I couldn't find it in any of the books, so I didn't know where it had come from. The painting of David Devant.
Yeah, that's a question I feel I should know the answer to. Where did that actually come from? Paul asked, where did David Devant Goliath come from? Where did the story about that? Because Paul, I know, has done a lot of research and tried to find the painting, and it doesn't seem to exist. You did find something else. Are you wanting to? A sculpture.
And I know, well, Jim Steinman was also looking for it, but we found some, yeah, there were some sculptures, but there was David Devant, also Devant, other people, you know. And so I think Jim Riley observed that he spent a lot of time standing in front of things. But we haven't found any particular painting.
You haven't found well, there we are. There's something we can throw out to the audience. Let's see if we can track down an original David Devant Goliath painting, if we can. Yeah. John, yes.
Are we sure that there were no ghostwriters involved in Devant's books?
Do you know what my answer is going to be? I don't know. I think that Devant was a good writer. I mean, whether he bothered, I suspect maybe when it came for sort of tricks for everyone and the sort of, you know, basically regurgitation of his tricks. But if you sort of read his style, he is a very, very good writer. And quite clearly, he wrote My Magic Life and The Secrets of My Magic, because, you know, they were dictated and stuff to Will Curtis. And I suspect he probably did write most of his stuff. I just have that has that feeling to me of credibility. In Woes of a Wizard, nobody could have. I mean, it's extraordinary to sort of write something like, I'm only doing this for the money and not for the magic. I can't believe, you know, that he wouldn't have actually written that. So the answer is, I don't know, but I suspect, I think the quality of the writing really shines out with Devant to me. I think he was just instinctively very good. Laura, yeah.
I believe we have a film that you found of David performing magic. Well, where were those shown? Were they at the Egyptian Hall?
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Do you want to, answer that?
Okay, so all the original film footage is probably that Devant filmed in the late 1900s is probably rotted away, as all celluloid film did.
1, 2.
But
Sorry, you just...
One on this.
Oh, you're on that?
Yes.
I should have given this to other people, haven't I? I forgot about it, sorry.
So all the subsequent celluloid film had probably rotted away, but there was a system in the sort of 1910s was created called the Kinora system, which was equivalent of renting videos in the 1980s, whereby you had these little carousels of paper that you, like a flick book essentially. So they were the means by which those original films were preserved, shall we say. And so the Kinora reels are sort of fairly common, and so we found some Kinora reels down in the museum and we just reanimated them. So although they look like films, it's stop-go animation like in a cartoon, and it just played, it looks like film, but it's a series of photographs. And interestingly, you spoke about the twinkle in Devant's eye. When we animated the film for the first time, you actually saw the twinkle in his eye, and it was really chilling.
He did do a film with Robert Paul, who I mentioned earlier, about who he bought the projector off in 1896, which is him performing on top of a theatre, doing a sort of trick photography little sequence, which I assume probably was shown. I think it was done for show. You know the one I'm talking about, Paul. Any thoughts on that? Or?
No, I think I don't remember what the company was, but there was about 30 different short films that you could, and one of them was like carts going along the street, and it was those kind of early films like the Lumiere brothers, and it was one that's listed on, you know, a magician, you know, Devant performing, and I think it was on top of the Alhambra because they had to do it outdoors because of the light.
Yeah. So that would have been shown, I think, as part of, people would have shown that, wouldn't they, as a sort of...
I think you could rent it as part of one of the films that were made.
Another question here. Were his animated photographs magic lantern shows? And if so, how popular were they? Well, they weren't magic lantern shows because magic lantern was a different form of thing from the Lumiere brothers. Can you add anything to that? If so, how popular were they? I'm not sure if he's referring to the animated photographs. How popular were they? Well, extremely. Oh, do you want to say something, Peter? Yeah. Do you want to take this because it might be? No.
First of all, an excellent talk. As far as the films go, in those days there were no films over 2 minutes long. 2 minutes was a long film. They were 1 minute or 2 minutes when they were first made. So the one that you see there, that we've got animated, is almost the whole of that section. The other thing is that you showed a picture of the projector in
Egyptian Hall.
Egyptian Hall, isn't it? Yeah, in Egyptian Hall. That is not a cinematograph. That is a magic lantern. It's a triunal magic lantern.
Right.
With three projectors. So it's not a cinematograph.
So I talked rubbish then, basically.
only on that one point. No, it was an excellent talk. I did start off by saying that.
Well, I'm very glad you said that then. Right. Stupid question coming up there. Yeah. So what does that mean? But basically they were, this man says, or this woman, sorry, were his animated photographs magic lantern shows?
No. No, they started off doing magic lantern shows using that triunal with three lenses. That was a magic lantern show using magic lantern slides, which you projected onto a screen. They were basically like a slide projector.
Right.
Then he bought the animated pictures, and they were films.
Right,
it's
I
not
see.
the same thing.
Right, I see. I just showed an early model rather than the
that
actual
is
projector.
a magic lantern.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that any photographs exist of the projection
Right.
that they use post magic lanterns.
No.
I've never seen one.
No.
Okay.
Maskelyne himself did in fact invent a cinematograph, which wasn't successful. Didn't work properly.
Right.
He tried to make his own.
I'm conscious of time. We've only got 4 minutes left, so I will. Paul, do you want to make it? Did you?
No, I was just, if you only got 4 minutes, I wanted you to just talk a fraction more about George Méliès, because it's such an interesting thing, but if you've only got 4 minutes, that's
Yeah. And what do I know about George Méliès? Nothing at all. So I've got out of that one quite nicely, thank you. Yeah, I haven't got time for that, I'm afraid. I could tell you quite a lot about him, but maybe come and see me afterwards. Yeah, Richard down here, because Mark's already, yep.
Can I just ask, the command performance, was that the one at the Palace Theatre? The command performance, was
the
that
command. Was the command performance of the Palace Theatre, and yes, it was. Yep.
Banned Mary Lloyd from it.
They banned.
Mary Lloyd wasn't allowed to appear.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, Mary Lloyd, because she was too risque. Yeah. Yeah, Mark.
The online questions have worked better than you might have thought, because I think you may be looking at a different thread or facility. There's two questions that have appeared here. One from Stephen Spence, which you've already answered. Because of Devant's illness, did he end up destitute?
Right, yeah.
And the other one from Joe Badman, which I think is a great question. If David Devant was working in 2018 and was performing around the banquet tables at a corporate function, what might we expect him to perform?
If David Devant was working the question there, if you didn't hear that, if David Devant was working, was doing close-up magic at a corporate function, what type of tricks would you expect him to perform? It's just horrific thought, isn't it, really? And that somebody might be reduced to those circumstances. The only thing is that basically close-up didn't really sort of exist as a formal form of entertainment as far as I'm aware. So, but I mean, Devant, to be fair to him, was very innovative. He would have adapted. I think there's no doubt about it. but one hopes he might be doing the after-dinner cabaret rather than the close-up round the tables. I like to think that anyway.
You can always do that one that's on the screen now. That's quite good.
The rising card. Yeah, unfortunately, you can see the. It's actually a trick photography. You can see the wires attached. I wanted to end this talk on a high, but Mark has reduced it down to an extremely low level. But anyway, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming on. To be honest, when I walked down on stage, I was expecting to see hardly anybody at all. So thank you very much for coming in. And a particular thank you to the SAM for locking into this as well. And I hope it was enjoyable to you in the States as well. Hopefully over here as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Well done. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed again, Ian. In a few weeks' time, Peter Lane will be doing a lecture on Chung Ling Soo, and you can ask him some tricky questions. So just a few more things. One more thing to say is thank you very much to the SAM for watching. And the second thing is that George Inglesias is lecturing next week with a lecture called Out of the Box. And lastly, I wish you a very pleasant evening and a safe journey home, particularly after not sleeping properly after the last 72 hours at Blackpool. So thank you very much indeed, and good night.